Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the Kanban Coaching Exchange 2022. I've got high hopes for this year, and I've already started planning in my holidays, so I'm going to be breaking up the year nicely. So it's great to see so many familiar faces and obviously lots of new ones as well. Welcome. So today, we have the honour of being able to kick off 2022 with the fabulous Joey Spooner. Now, Joey, I know through his work at the Kanban University, where he is, and I had to write it down because it's very long, the Vice President of Community Development and Product Management. That'll be one to explain to your kids. What do you do, Dad? But I love Joey because he's the person who's helping to drive things forward in the Kanban University. He works very closely and leads the accredited consultant program, helping people to kind of like get their wings around the consultancy. And he's also driving lots of change. And I think that's absolutely key. And that's, what helps keep me interested in Kanban, because we're constantly thinking about new ways to innovate and how we can improve the world of work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Joey. Take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Ellen. And thank you all for showing up today. I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about the Kanban method, but in particular, how it works in light of what we call the preventable pandemics. So we find at Kanban University a common pattern, and you may find it as well in your coaching experiences, of transformations and reorganizations happening rather continuously. So at Kanban University, we see two different types. It's the transformation one, which is the idea of, hey, if we're just agile, if we want to be agile, all we have to do is transform. Just transform how we're working, and we'll get there. And then there's another one that we find as well, and I'll show you that in a second, but this is really important as well, which is, hey, from a large food services provider we talked to about, I want to say maybe 6 months ago, we asked them how their transformation was going, and they said, which one? We've got 4 or 5 currently in progress. This is literally someone from the field who's working with us and talking with us. And then there's the reorganizationitis, which is the other pandemic that we see happening, which is every quarter, maybe every 6 months, let's reorganize how we operate to be more efficient, to be more agile. That'll really get us there. That's the solution we need. And then when we talk with people from the field who do this, we ask them, how's it going? We're curious. And they said, well, we've had 6 reorganizations in the past 6 quarters. And so far, we're continuing to try to reorganize to be the most optimal we can be. So these are a lot of disruptions we see happening in the marketplace very frequently. And I'm kind of curious for a second here, and you guys are welcome to type in the chat. Any guesses as to what these organizational structures have in common? Take a look, take a moment here, just kind of browse. And if you have an answer or two, just pop in an answer here in the chat. What's in common with all these? All right. Victoria, complexity, dependencies, relationships to manage, teams. Yeah. Good answers.
It looks like there's a top point, like apart from one, there's like one that looks like it cascades down.
Yeah, definitely a structure, human, right, Helen? People kind of at the top going down. Yeah, these are good answers. The amazing answer is they all work. They all run multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar organizations, or in this case of Apple, trillion-dollar organizations. So these are all functional structures, and there's nothing really crazy about them. They have their own style, their own approach. So in light of that, if you try to transform that, there's a good chance that it's not going to work out well. And in fact, some of you here know this already, know this story of John Cotter, who back in 1995 had analyzed the marketplace and said, hey, 70% of transformations are quite likely to fail, Most recently, in this past year, this past quarter, Harvard Business Review went out and did a research survey again and came back with the results of major corporations like Microsoft, PayPal, a few other ones. And they said only 22% of the scope of companies that we analyzed actually successfully transformed themselves. So even less than 30% success. Remember, Cotter said 70% would fail and only 30% might succeed. It's actually about 22 right now at best. So this is a common pattern we see happening where there's this idea of we're going to change, and we're going to change by changing how we look, changing how we operate, as a business in terms of how we're organized or how we handle technology or how we operate some little activity. That really isn't it. And Connor was an optimist in this case. And I wanted to kind of take you guys through a couple of more ideas of what optimism might look like. So there are a couple of examples of evidence that you might find in your job as a coach or consultant where you've heard something like this. So you might hear something like this when you're in a meeting with your peers. Our enterprise transformation would have produced meaningful results only if, or if only, we had the executive support we needed. Now, I'm sure some of you probably heard that one before. I know I have, where they say we need leadership to understand this and to really give us air coverage. Here's another one. If people didn't resist the change, they just simply said, let's take that on, let's be happy with it, let's work with that change, right? You want me to limit my WIP? No problem, I'll do that with you. Okay, that's all we need. Or maybe only you need trust. If there was simply more trust, easy, we got it. This is what's going to take the solution to the end point. We're going to be happy about it. Or maybe if only you had better OKRs. OKRs are really popular right now. They're just picking up a lot of traction. That's all you need. Simple. Just have better ways of saying, this is what we want you to do. And then we have some key results behind that. And that'll change how we operate. That'll make us agile. Or maybe it's only if teams are willing to collaborate with each other, if they just simply got together and started talking to each other. So that previous diagram of organizational structure, some people pointed out teams, and a lot of people focus on that team collaboration. And maybe that's all we need to have done here, managing the dependencies by having teams collaborate better. Maybe not. What about if only we had more leadership? So right now, along LinkedIn, along Twitter, I see a lot of stuff bubbling up right now around leadership. We just need to understand what leadership is, develop better leadership skills. Maybe that's all we need. Or maybe if only we had fewer dependencies, right? Let's put a whole team together, scrub the other team, bring them in, integrate it, call it one big massive team. Now we got rid of our dependencies. That kind of thinking. Maybe it's only if customers were more responsive. Simply, if we just had customers who cared about us like we care about them, that would solve our problem. We could transform and be more customer friendly that way. And last but not least, if we can only get everyone together and actually have a real discussion. So let's bring in a professional facilitator. Let's run some of these facilitated meetings and actually have a serious discussion around what we need to do to improve, right? That's what will help us. Facilitated discussions don't usually solve these problems. If anything, they bring them up, they kind of hold them there. It's hard to get beyond this point. And this is sometimes what we call wishful thinking in the Kanban method. These are things that we wished would solve our problems. Typically, they don't, even if you get what you're looking for. So how did we get here? That's a big question a lot of people want to ask. How did you get to this place where you're not really getting where you want to be? And some of you may recognize this diagram, although I've probably modified it a bit beyond what you normally would see. I call it the trip up. This is the typical, we're going to spend 18 months or more figuring out what you do right now and then designing a future optimized way of working. And we're going to transform you into that new way of working, reorganize you, transform you, help you learn all these new skills. And we're going to call this agility. Then you're going to learn how to do agility by simply having better tooling, better organizational structures. Those kinds of results are what they're looking for. Now, keep in mind that the whole organization is transforming this way. It's going to be the focal point for the next 18 to 24 months. What we're trying to do is achieve a checkbox. We do this new dance, now we are agile. That can be problematic. And that's what typically is called big design up front. A lot of you know this already, but I just wanted to remind you, that's what we're thinking about here. And so in a lot of cases, it's the change being pushed onto people that's being resisted here. And it drags out, it slows down. And so people don't resist the change themselves, but they do resist change being pushed onto them. And this kind of leads us to something that some of you may already know, but if you're new to this, this is something we talk about a lot. We would love people to be robots if you're handling change, because then they basically say logically, oh, this makes a lot of sense, no problem. I will simply adapt to this change. I will want this change. I will work quickly with this change. I will move on with life, no problem at all. But we're human beings, and we think right about here at the bottom of our brain first. That's where we first receive information, where we think about things. Sure, we use the prefrontal cortex if we want to, but we're always going to have emotions before we have logic. So we're always going to feel change emotionally first and then adapt slowly off of that, because we're going to think about our feelings a lot. They're what help us survive. And a lot of times I joke with people, the robot on the right is what you want, but what you get is the human being on the left. So just keep that in mind. When we're talking about change, that's a critical factor in all of this. And so behind every logical excuse you get as a coach or a consultant, you're probably gonna have an emotional response underneath that that's really driving this behavior. So people need a humane approach to change. They don't need something that is structured, formalized, and pushed onto them. They need a way to say, start with where you are now. And they need to know what to do with that approach. So how do you get started with where you are now? How do you improve? And what kind of confidence can you build off of what's there to actually suggest that what we're going to tell you actually works? So keep in mind, you're asking someone to change, and you're asking them to change in a very dramatic fashion if you're not careful. And what we try to do is say, wait, take that down a couple of notches. Think about what's psychologically achievable and what builds confidence over time. And this is a whole field of work, at least for me, it's a whole field of work called Small Wins out of Harvard Business. Really exciting stuff. So at Kanban University, we tend to look for pragmatic, actionable, evidence-based guidance. We're saying, let's go see what people do, what works well. Let's integrate that back into what we teach so that people can understand this comes from a source of experience, not theory or philosophy necessarily. So evolutionary change in our world is humane. We start with where you are, we slowly build up where you go, and it should make sense over time that you're making decisions that are adopted by the team, adopted by the individual, and supported by them, not necessarily pushed on them. So when we look at evolutionary change, we have this approach that we take. Now there on the left side here is capability, horizontal is time. How long will this change take? And what will happen to the capability of the organization or of the individual team as they go through change? And what you find is you're somewhere here. You're starting somewhere at a current state, and you're going to transition into a future state. Now, remember, we talked about this, the idea of going from A to B, kind of going from your current place to your future place. And ideally, you want it to be deterministic, like we're just going to go from here to here, easy as pie. No resistance, no problems. Everything's going to work out great. We'll do this in 18 months. We'll walk out the door and we'll call it success. The reality is it looks a bit more like this. You start to introduce the change. Things get harder for people to do. They get confused. They don't know which way to turn. They lose confidence and they start to go slower and take longer. They can even be frustrated. So remember, this whole little squiggly curve here is about emotionality, focus, and capability. And it starts to drag a little bit. And you start to lose safety in this place. I'm sure some of you have been in this job before where you've actually sat in the position of having change pushed on you and you question, am I safe anymore in my job? And that's what some people are thinking about when they have change to push on them. Now on the horizontal here, along with time is a sense of patience. And that's patience for everybody involved in the change, especially the executive people who are sponsoring this change. They're running into problems thinking, how much longer can we wait before we have to revert and roll back this change because it's not working for us. You've probably seen some epic ones in organizations. I know of one, I can't say where in the federal sector, but I heard a great story in the federal sector where they said, oops, wrong decision, let's roll back this $2 million project. And then they realized along with that, that they had lost access to their own data. Big problem there. So this is the kind of thing that you run into with change and time. Now you'll notice that right here on the bottom right corner is an interesting little space in that curve where lower maturity organizations start to freak out and they roll back. And that's a good example of what I just told you. They tried to put a new system into place. They realized, oh my goodness, this is a huge mistake. And they rolled back. They didn't get out of that trough. They rolled back out of fear. And sometimes changes in policies, changes in organizational behavior are rolled back because there's a lack of tolerance, a lack of confidence to see something through. And what we find in terms of a bigger picture, at least from a recent organizational change management publication from PMI, is that about 18% of these changes are effective. And this correlates a little bit with the 22% that I talked about earlier from HBR. So there's at least some modicum of success, but the majority are somewhat moderately effective. And then there's about a 20%, 18% failure rate on the other end of this. So not horrible, but not great, and not so much fun, right? Now, when we use the Kanban method, and we talk about this a bit more here in a second, We're talking about how we avoid failure. And we avoid failure in terms of large-scale change and design and manage transformations. Because there are other ways to do this than simply saying, let's design the whole thing up front and see what happens. So when we're looking at evolutionary change, like you just saw, there's little dips in the curve. It starts with an initial maturity. Where are you right now? And we're going to talk more about maturity, but it could be something as simple as like, we have no clue what we're doing. I talked to someone yesterday. Yes, it was yesterday. And I can't say where, but all of us would know who it is. And they said, we have no clue what we're doing. I was like, oh, wow, this is impressive. You're a well-known brand, you're a well-known organization. Yeah, but we're doing something and we're in this pocket of the organization, we're kind of grouped together. We have no clue. So they don't even know their initial maturity. So with the Kanban method, you would have first identify kind of where you are and then evaluate how fit you are. And then from there, continue on this pathway of trying to improve. So you might say, we're right here and the customer is not happy. They want us to be able to do this, or internally, we're not happy. We want to be able to do this following thing. It could be less time in terms of getting stuff out the door. It could be better quality. It could be handling less work, which is kind of crazy to say, but a lot of people would benefit, I think, these days from having less to focus on and producing better quality results. So along the way, you're looking at your fitness for how you actually improve, and you get better in your maturity over time. And you keep going forward and forward, trying new things out, trying to improve what you do. And eventually you might find that you have to roll back because you're trying to bite off more than you can chew. I have one from the technical world where I used to work, which is we tried to do test-driven development 5 times and had to roll back 5 times. And eventually we figured out how to roll forward, which was the idea of, yeah, now we know how to take on test-driven development. And after that, we would have probably evaluated ourselves for further things around fitness. What else can we do to be further fit, more secure, better quality, more timeliness in terms of getting the product out the door, more predictable ultimately, which is where this kind of leads to. So we're looking at an idea that the maturity is emergent. It is not deterministic. This is a big difference out there in the world. So keep that in mind as we're looking at the Kanban method. We don't say, here's your prescription for the next 18 months. We say, here's your stuff that you can consider doing. It's really up to you as a coach, you as a team, you as an organization to figure out where you want to go. And you're going to have to wait and see what happens. You can't say, we know where the road will take us in the next 24 months or even the next year. So just keep in mind, this is always evolving, always emergent. There is no one right way to do this. There are some very good ways to get started though. And I think I mentioned this to you a second ago. Start with what you do now. So understand your current processes, respect what's currently there. Don't reorganize if you can avoid reorganizing. Respect the responsibilities and the job titles. And then get agreement to improve, right? Look at evolutionary change as the approach to improvement, not deterministic change. And then actually work on leadership at all levels. So talking with your peers, talking with your managers, talking with your staff. What can you do to actually act on this? What are some techniques you can use to actually get leadership to engage? And this is not just your senior leadership. This is people who need to voice change. Supporters, maybe people who are resisting, work with them. And speaking of resisting, there is one thing that we suggest you do in the Kanban method, and I'll probably talk about it a little bit more if we have time, which is the idea of avoiding the rock. So instead of trying to fight against the most resistant person in the change that you're trying to introduce with the Kanban method, you say, hey, why don't we continue moving on? And if this person wants to move on with us, they can, but they don't have to. So let's carry on and keep moving forward with our change. And that's one example of what you might run into with resistance. Another one I can give you very directly from my work in the field is I tried to talk to someone who was a lead engineer about 4 or 5 times, 2 hours per time. And I kept giving him ideas for, hey, this is why you might want to limit WIP. This is why you might want to pair up on work. And he never bought off on it. After that 4th time of talking with him over 2 hours each time, I realized I am wasting my time. I am wasting my calories talking to this person. They're never going to change. And that's okay. But what's not okay is for me to continue working on this, talking with this person, and they're not going to budge. They are the rock. So I let them sit. I told them they didn't have to come to any of our review meetings for our service delivery. We'll just keep on trucking. And lo and behold, about 4 months later, they found a new job. They just said, I'm not happy here anymore. I said, good. You need to be a hero lighting fires somewhere else. That's kind of what they were doing ultimately in behavior. So they carried on, and we actually had about a 10% improvement in performance once they left. So keep that in mind when we're looking at the rock. So one thing in particular, again, start with where you are and evolve. And in particular, start where you are and encourage better alignment between groups, especially collaboration between groups. So we're not saying make the most of your communication, but we are saying figure out where you are and how you all operate together. Develop that systems view instead of trying to reorganize into something that's popular. Nothing wrong with these, but I wouldn't recommend going into the idea of saying, let's do pods, squads, chapters, flocks, herds, packs, or mobs. Not necessarily needed. I'm not against mob programming, by the way. Love it. But I don't think you need an organizational structure to support that. And so when we look at reorganization, a lot of times, it's not really necessarily pragmatic. It's not actionable. Most people don't favor it. It's typically resisted, and usually it causes a lot of delays. So if you reorganize, if you try to transform, there's a good chance it's going to have more of a negative impact than a positive impact, at least initially, for sure. And so when we're looking at the Kanban method, no one's going to get a new job role or title or responsibilities. We're basically saying, where are you right now? Let's improve where you are starting from. And by the way, while we love training at Kanban University, love it, we're always looking out for hey, let's send everybody to training and then we're done. That kind of formula is not a formula for success. So just keep that in mind. Training is a core component, but not the only solution here. So when we look at things like forced identity change, like we're talking about here, where suddenly you've gone to training and now you have a new title because you got a certificate, that's probably going to invoke some passive aggressive resistance. It's not actionable behavior. It's just simply setting people up to be angry. So when we're looking at this, we need some more pragmatic guidance, actionable evidence-based guidance. And some of you probably know this book fairly well by now. You probably have read it. It's a wee bit thick, yay thick. So I would recommend you carefully look through it occasionally and think about it. But in this maturity model, we've codified quite a bit of what happens in the Kanban method, especially practices and different ideas for how you can actually go about making evolutionary change happen in your environment without imposing it on people. So what we have here are about 150 practices, and these are tied back to observable business outcomes. Now we have 7 levels of organizational maturity mapped against this, which is kind of exciting, but in reality, a lot of you guys are going to hang out in a couple of different areas of maturity. This is at least my bet for you. But when we get into this in a second, you'll see a relationship between culture, practices, and outcomes. So to keep in mind that we're not just looking at simply, are you doing the practices, therefore you are done, you've done a great job. We're looking at that relationship, the culture of the organization that you're in, the outcomes that they're trying to achieve from a business level, and then the practices. So keep that in mind. We're not looking at simply just saying, oh, now you're doing limiting WIP. Great. So what? Applaud yourself on the back. What's the actual business outcome you're getting from limiting the WIP? That's what we're chasing after here. So when you look at something like the maturity model, if you haven't looked at it before, you'll find that we have these levels, 0 through 6, oblivious all the way down to built for survival. And we have really 2 different ways of looking at the maturity model. One is, don't jump too far. You're looking at someone who's absolutely guilty of this. About 7 years ago, right before Christmas, I said, let's build a Kanban system. And we use this really great formula for doing it. This great approach. It was before static came out and was really well known. And so we started doing this and we gold-plated our process. We went from really team level focused all the way to probably ML3, fit for purpose. And we had something like 24 different policies for how we're going to operate ourselves. We had like 8 different columns for our Kanban system. We were so excited. And then we started using it and we used half of the columns and we used half of the policies because we had actually overreached. And we realized that was not the healthy way to do it. Now, the other one is kind of hanging out where you are and not moving beyond that, which is fault summit plateaus. Now this, by the way, the maturity model, you can look at it through 2 different lenses very easily. One is simply what practices are you using? And then also, where are you in terms of what kind of things you're using? So we're not just sitting here saying, well, you're only going to be using Kanban practices. You could be using other methodologies, other approaches, and evaluate how that's performing for the business and how that's performing for the team, perhaps, and decide where you are. And we find a lot of organizations are using other agile approaches, which aren't bad, but they kind of hang out and get stuck. And they just hang out for a long time in sort of this team level focused approach They kind of try to scale, but they don't go much further in the conversation with scaling. And that's where they run into what we call false summit plateaus. Everything's being reported as green, everything looks great, but we're not really getting anywhere. So again, when we're looking at overreaching and plateauing, it's worth mentioning that we have two different ways of looking at this from our curve previously. One is overreaching simply being you're going too deep. A lot of us here probably in this media are geeks. We love the details. We love to know how to coach more. We love to know how to apply cool techniques to improve performance, perhaps. If we're not careful, we're idealizing the outcome for ourselves and not where the team really needs to be or the organization needs to be. So keep that in mind, that overreaching is a very tricky trap for us. Another place where a lot of organizations can force people into is the idea of performance reporting at a certain level and just saying, we're always going to report this way. We don't expect things to be crazy. We just expect you to deliver every time on your commitment. Okay, so in the Kanban space, we call that due date performance. So every time you commit to something for a due date, you always have 100% on time due date performance. Well, that's great, but what if you don't improve beyond that? Okay, well, that's kind of a false summit plateau. We're just going to kind of float here and always meet the commitment that we made every time. We're always going to try and avoid the risk of trying to improve. So keep that in mind. That's another place where you might find yourselves at. And so you have this missed benefit potentially of going better, getting better at what you do, actually achieving better business outcomes. Within the Kanban method, we have this approach that I think is really, really powerful. And it's going to become, I think, ultimately one of our key algorithmic pieces of our coaching program. And that is the idea, it's really simple, of stress, reflect, and lead. So this idea of saying, let's introduce a small stressor. What can we introduce into the organization or into a team to improve what they're doing, to get them out of, for example, the stuckness, the idleness, the busyness, and then help them to reflect on what they do. Try something new, reflect on that new thing, and then decide, is that the right thing to do, or should we try something else? Lead on that level. And so that's a very simple formula. It's really, really powerful as you start to get into our coaching methodology. So I wanted to walk you through just a couple of different levels, about 3 different levels of the maturity model that I think you're probably going to find yourselves in it somewhere along the way. ML1 is really the oblivious area where everyone's doing it their own way. So if you work with a group of individuals like the one I talked to yesterday, everyone's doing their own thing. They're trying to hustle. They have reporting structures that are crazy. They have resource management that's crazy. They really don't have a real cohesive look and feel as a team or beyond the team level. And so they're oblivious, right? There's no focus on trying to make sure people don't get overburdened. And there's a lot of unhappy people in terms of customers, managers, and actually employees. And that's a common place to find either an organization that's reorganized itself, or maybe trying to go through a transformation, or possibly it's a startup, and it's kind of chaotic there. So one of the things that we recommend for coaches to consider, visualizing work at the team level, ABC type stuff here. Can we get a visualization? Remember, if you're a coach and you're doing the Kanban method, you're going to say, let's show you what is right now. And some of you who have been here for a long time, I see some AKCs here, one of the tricks we might use is the idea of saying, let's just do a 0 to 100% on the column level, and you can drag across the column until you're at 100% to then kind of reverse out what your key activities might be. And I've done that before for social media teams, which are really crazy and busy. You might consider limiting work in progress. You might decide, here, what are the initial policies? How do we know we're actually committing to it? And how do we know when it's really done? Those are 2 very basic ones right there. And then having a feedback meeting. Again, reflect, right? Reflect on how are we doing? And that's a Kanban meeting. And in particular, that's how are we doing probably on a daily basis for about 5 minutes. And it's not we as individuals, it's the board that we're looking at. So we're changing the focus from the individual to more of a team level kind of view, which is what leads us to ML1. Once we cross that threshold, we're probably going to find that we have a team focus, but we don't deliver the same way twice. It's like everyone kind of has their own nuances for how they get the work done. And this is a bit of an older quote, but it's still very true. It's from an agile coach who was with an internet equipment manufacturer in China. And he said, every team reports they have delivery on their commitments or hitting their commitments. But I know that the customers are waiting longer than 6 months for delivery. That's crazy. So even though we have all greens on the inside, on the outside, the customer's not happy. So again, business outcomes aren't really getting achieved at this level. Everything looks great on the inside. So you might want to look at a service-oriented workflow. So going above the board view for an individual team, kind of looking more at the customer focus and saying what's really taking place throughout the whole pathway from beginning to end for the customer. And talking about that from a data perspective a little bit, using what's called a flow review, thinking more critically about that. Now, you might find that if you can look at the data and get a little bit better, you will probably find yourselves in a space called customer driven, because you're listening to your customers, you're trying to deliver on their needs, and you try to orchestrate internally to achieve that. But the problem is you might not have the same result twice. That orchestration may not be working quite right. And you're probably going to find managers doing heroic things at night, early in the morning, trying to make sure that the connections are in place to solve the problems that are creating delays effectively, or creating quality problems. So a lot of last minute tension to get things out the door, a lot of hustle, a lot of small wins inside the organization, but there's a lot of frustration because it doesn't feel stable. It doesn't feel predictable. You're constantly trying to get things done every time. It's a big hustle. So there you might want to look into more lead time analysis. So a lot of you probably on this call are geeks like me. You probably enjoy looking at lead time histograms for fun. In fact, you probably apply it to more than just Kanban in the field of knowledge management, but you really are probably enjoying looking at data. You probably want to have someone who's got a hat that they wear called a service delivery manager role, which means their responsibility is to make sure things get moved across fairly evenly across a Kanban system, or things that get delayed get paid attention to. So no one's avoiding the problem or the pain. And there's a service delivery review, which actually exposes more opportunities for wins. And I've run a lot of service delivery reviews before, and I really enjoy them because there's always low-hanging fruit staring at the team or staring at the organization when you look at the data. So keep that in mind. And this is kind of what we see. For those who haven't looked at Kanban before, they're newcomers to this meetup, you might not recognize what this is, but this is actually what we call a pull-based system. So you'll see these numbers here at the top of the board. They indicate how much work can be in progress, the maximum amount of work, and also probably the minimum amount of work. And so the goal here is to make sure this system is always getting fed with some work to do, and that it's actually producing the work at a reasonable rate. The reality is the rate may not be what people want, and so you have to work on improving internally in the scope of that system. So you can see here we have, 16 items that we have in progress. And right now we have, 4, 6, 8, 10 items. So we're short a little bit. We actually could use a little bit more work. You'll notice how 5 over here in the ready column, 5 is only 2. And in fact, 1, Mr. H here, is about to pop over to develop. That means we have room for 4 more pretty soon here. That's something that triggers a pull-based behavior. And that's a key concept that we're trying to get across to people, is that you can actually have a stable environment where you can pull in things based on your capacity. This is a new kind of twist for a lot of people. But if you can do that, and if you can get stable at doing that, reliable at doing that, you get into what's called predictable delivery. So you're taking in new work and putting out existing work at a relatively balanced rate. That's a big deal. So that helps people to focus on getting work done. They don't feel like they have to be heroic anymore. The process is probably going to be under some level of control. You can start to make promises that you can keep, and you can actually start to do that to your customers. So kind of like that internet equipment manufacturer from earlier, they no longer have to say everything's green on the inside and then apologize to their customers. They can say to their customers, yeah, this is green. We know it's green the minute we commit to it to you. So again, this is the idea behind the Kanban method, is following through on the commitments you can make and actually kind of landing on your business outcomes ultimately as you get more mature. So a couple of proverbs, and then we're going to wrap up here. One is, you probably heard this before if you're in the Kanban community, stop starting, start finishing. And we started talking about this, 2015, 2016, still a popular phrase. And in particular, focus on the work, not the workers. This is a challenging phrase. I keep finding organizations struggling to optimize the resource utilization of a human being. I don't know how you can do that. I'm impressed they try to. And also reorganize the work, not the workers. So keep in mind, a lot of times you try to shuffle people around and optimize your team structure. That's not the important thing. It's the inventory of work that you're trying to manage. That's the important thing here. So let's just briefly touch on a little evidence, and then we're wrapping up here. Because we love evidence here at Kanban University. If you haven't heard of us before, this is your first time, or this is kind of you dabbling into Kanban, take a look at Kanban University's website and look for the video section, because we have lots of evidence of how this stuff gets used in the marketplace. One particular example is Vanguard. Some of you may know about this one. This was a great example of how they started off with Scrum, and they were doing pretty good, but you'll notice there's kind of a flat line to this data, which means their lead times were pretty much consistent, roughly pretty flat, not great, not bad. But after a while, they started using Kanban. And in about 90 days of Kanban, you'll see how they reduced a lot of different things here. This represents the fact that they got rid of a lot of what I call pop flies. So above that red line are the gotchas. Oh, quality problems, delays we didn't expect, possibly some other things that screwed us up. And they caused us to take longer getting this work done. So on that vertical axis is how much time. On the horizontal axis is the date in which this thing took place. So you'll notice how over a period of time, about 90 days, they basically got rid of all their potential defects or things that caused delay. They really reduced them a lot, down below 40 days on average. And eventually they started reducing things even further. So you can see how this black line goes down. That's a positive signal saying, hey, look, we're getting faster at what we do. That's a big deal for market competitiveness. That's kind of some of the goal behind agility. And that's really responding, hopefully, to your customers and delivering faster to your customer needs. Big deal. So a lot of times this is called, nowadays, we call this a little bit of Scrum stall. It seems to happen occasionally where you start to stall out and you're not able to move forward in a healthy fashion. You just kind of keep reporting green on the inside. Now, this is another way to look at it from a cumulative flow diagram. You'll notice how they gauge themselves at basically a level 1 to 2, which means, again, team level focused, maybe customer focused a little bit. And then they kicked into level 3, where they said we have a limited system, we have stability, we have engagement with our customers, we know what they want, we're able to deliver it faster, and we're able to solve some of these problems that get in our way, either qualitative problems or dependent problems. And that moved them into level 3. And you'll notice that that angle keeps going up, which means they're getting faster and faster over time. So if you want to know more, I'm sure a lot of people here are Kanban fans, but if you haven't learned about this, we have a website where you can download, learn, contact, and engage us. And there's a free guide out there for the official guide to Kanban. Really cool guide, helps you to understand the ABCs. You probably already understand it. Give it to your executives who really don't understand this stuff because they'll understand it pretty quickly, or maybe some managers. Definitely a good guide for that. And that is it. So thank you for having me. And I'd love to dive into questions now.
So thank you very much there, Joey. Let's give him a round of applause for his efforts.
Yep. Woo, thank you.
Doesn't have the same impact as in person. Okay, so what questions have we got for Joey? If not, I've got one to kick you off.
Let's see. I think that's...
Cool. Andrew Kidd's got one. He's got his hand up.
Yay. Good evening. Thanks, Joey. That was really, really cool. Especially like the sort of first half as the intro to some of the KSD slides. So yeah, firmer favorites there. But I'm just wondering, what in your experience are the sort of pulls that you get from customers that enable you to then say, aha, I have something in my toolkit here. It's called the maturity model. Let me explain. What sort of pull do you get from customers that gives you an invitation and permission to introduce the KMM?
Yeah, great question, Andrew. So my opinion on it is we have to respect who we're talking to. And oftentimes we get excited about the technicality of what we're talking about, and we accidentally ignore the real need of the customer. And so if you've ever been in a close relationship with someone and you over-explain something, they kind of give you like a weird look, like, I just wanted a yes or no answer to this question. And I find that to be one of our common trip-ups in the Kanban coaching space, is that we over-geek the situation. Now, we may not be wrong with what we're thinking, but the way we approach it with the customer or the client, it looks really foreign to them. And so we start to bring out all these really cool tools, and they go, I just needed a pipe fixed. I didn't need you to like redig the trench to my house for the pipe. So keep in mind when we're talking about this, what I often say is, what are your problems right now? And don't worry about my solutions. Let me come to the table with some ideas for you. But here's the general formula I'm going to introduce to them. Hey, why don't we add a little something? Let's not go big. Let's go small. Let's introduce a small incremental change, something that's more evolutionary and experimental in nature. And I've got a whole bag of things I can pull out and show you, but let's not go into that. Let's focus on what you need. what are the business problems you're trying to solve with this need? Are there real business problems, or is this just simply a cultural problem? So I have to kind of start picking that apart and then integrate that into an actual, what I call evolutionary change canvas. We have that in our KCP training. And that allows me to frame what this change looks like, allows me to look at the barriers, and then possibly what's the pathway going to look like to get to that next level in terms of the actual outcome that's needed. So I tend to kind of push back a little bit on defining what the problem is first before saying, here's some of the things we might want to try.
Of course, so you may introduce, it sounds like you're introducing it as a very soft on-ramps into different aspects of the KMM. And I'm thinking now of some of the posters where we're looking at some of the behaviors and almost seeding the interest, waiting for the customer to almost ask for, what are the linkages between these things then?
And so Andrew, I hate to dash your spirit here. They may never ask for the linkages. They may just simply say, can you get me across the street? That's all I want. And you go, great, let's work on that pathway with you. And you as a coach or as a trainer maybe say, hey, let me work with some of your people and help educate them on how to do this. Or is it on my hands as a coach to do it for you? Let me walk you through those steps without overwhelming you with all the details of what I could put on the table.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's very tough. And if you're here at Kanban University, you're one of our trainers or consultants, I encourage you to join our sales and Kanban conversations where we're diving into exactly this kind of behavior, saying, let's move away from simply train them, or let's move away from simply consult them and tell them exactly what to do, to really, what are their problems? And let's make sure the problems are very clear and then move from there into the right direction. It's huge. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got one question for you, Jerry.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about evolutionary change, totally bought into that. But at some point, though, you might need to make kind of like a little bit of a major change.
Yeah.
Maybe you have to realign. And I think that's, because I get questioned a lot on my course about, well, actually, you can only do so much evolutionary change before you have to. So what experiences have you got around that? And what are your recommendations when you actually get to that point where I need to realign some people in the organization type activity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you may find that, so we have different levels of escalation that we consider in the coaching practices. And on the far end of that spectrum is something called a punctuation point, where you do force some change to happen if there's a real big level of resistance. But I've only been on the receiving end of punctuation points. I've never been in the privilege of saying, push the button and everything changes dramatically for us. So when it comes to, like, let's just say there are a couple of things that I've seen happen here. One is, I'm going to take you down two different answers here, Helen. One is the punctuation points happen to you already, and one is where you have difficult people working with you. The punctuation point that happens, usually it's like a bomb goes off in the building and suddenly all the rules of normal social policy and all these things are gone. All the identity is gone. You have room to reorganize, possibly room to actually change things, room to introduce some new policies that are hopefully helpful to then get the outcomes you're looking for. But again, I'm going to always chase the outcomes. We're doing this for some kind of outcome. What is that outcome so I can stay focused on that as I'm trying to coach my way through this scenario, which could look like a bombed out building, basically. It's like, whoa, what happened to this organization? I have one, I can't name their name, but I came to them right after they did this reorganization, after Thanksgiving back in like 2017. They said, we're gonna all do Scrum, and you were former project managers with your own distributed teams. Now you're all Scrum squads and pods and stuff like that. And they freaked out. Like, people that had been there for 20 years didn't know what to do. And they hated this whole new thing that was called Scrum. Again, Scrum is not bad, but they didn't know what to do with it. They felt completely challenged. So we actually helped them to figure out, wait a minute, you're here. Let's start with where you are. You've been forced in these buckets, but let's start with that and kind of grow out of these buckets where you are now and see what happens. So that was one approach that we took advantage of in a punctuation point kind of moment. Now, the flip side is you don't have the punctuation point like you're talking about, and you have this sort of continuous ebb of improvement. But the problem is you have some people who are just rocks. They just don't move. Now, those individuals, at some point, you do want to pull them aside and decide, what do we do with that individual? So I'm not going to reorganize the whole structure. I'm not going to change the whole team. But if there's one person who's just being a real jerk on the team, I'm going to pull them aside and let them know a few times. And then I am going to take them to counseling at some point with HR. Now, when I do, and I kid not, when I do Kanban, if I do it at large scale, I will talk to the person and say, can I talk to your HR person? No matter which change you introduce, no matter what kind of change you introduce, you're going to run into some people who are just going to behave poorly. And I mean unprofessionally, rude, abusive, antagonistic type people. You have to be prepared to handle those individuals from time to time. And those individuals might get moved to a different team and suddenly they're happy just because they didn't like the team they were on, they didn't know it. They could be changing a role and suddenly they're happier with the work that they're doing. Or it could simply be that, yeah, they're no longer a fit for this environment. They're used to something being on fire all the time. And we're trying to prevent ourselves from making fires. So that is something of a pathway I've taken before with real people in the field, where I've geared up people and said, look, we might have to remove this person. So those are the two different kind of pathways I think about when we look at individuals and this kind of change we're talking about.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
What other questions have you got for Joey? Get them while you can.
I see one from Kun. Is it just here in the Netherlands, or is resistance more than not the result of a lack of shared and inspiring goal? Yeah, that's a good question. When we actually use what's called static in the Kanban method, first thing that we typically want to try to do is actually get sources of dissatisfaction understood by the team or by the individuals involved in the change, as well as the customers or stakeholders. And hopefully at this point, when you do that work and you aggregate it and you vote on what to change, and that's usually where you start in terms of your initial incremental evolutionary change, you're going to say, let's change something here in the way we're doing our work. Hopefully at that point, the person who's a part of that group says, yeah, I'm bought into this to some level. But some people are like, none of this really bothers me. And that's a challenge there. But usually if we have that grouping activity, you're going to find that majority of people will probably come on board with this and say, yeah, there's a shared goal here now that we all agree to, because you've actually had that conversation. That's a big difference, because a lot of people are told, this is where we're going to go, and there's no conversation about it. Great question.
And thinking about, like, you've talked to us just about like the first few parts of the Kanban maturity model. And I imagine, like, if as an organization, if you get to like levels 3 and 4, then it feels in like a pretty good place. But
Yeah.
actually, the model goes much higher than that.
Yes.
And like, I guess one of the questions again I'm often asked is like, what are we aspiring to be like? What are some of the companies out there that are like level 5s, they're absolutely smashing it, they're sustainable, they can deal with reinvention, because this is what we're describing at those high levels.
Yeah.
What types of organizations do you see being able to achieve that?
Yeah, so let's go back a little bit here. I was doing this for time purposes, but because I wasn't sure how long this would take. So when we're looking at like beyond 3, for example, we have risk hedged businesses or market leaders or built for survival. Let's go to that. What I'm going to do is, one second here, I'm going to fix my presentation and show you guys some advanced stuff because we have time to dive in. Right here. There we are. So like, for example, if we're looking at ML4, I'm just going to go off script here a little bit so you guys can see this. What you have is effectively an organization that's looking at hedging its risk, which means we understand demand and we understand how to make good sense and good decisions with demand. We're predicting demand way far in advance. We know how to match our capabilities against that demand, and we can succeed as an organization. Think of this as like really, really good, powerful planning activities here. If you can do that and keep everything running at a sustainable pace without feeling stressed on trying to achieve something, then you've probably got a good organization that's risk hedged. Now, if we step beyond that, one level below that, or up, I should say, you got the best in the marketplace. Now, this is where you're paying attention to every little detail. You might have run across a few of these organizations that you worked with before, where every little thing is scripted, every little thing is clearly understood, and there is no gap for mistakes here. They're really trying to say, where else can we improve in small ways, like really tiny business outcome type ways, because they're really at the top of their game. Think of your favorite airline, like probably one of them out there is the market leader. And it's because they're simply the best and they're paying attention to every little detail of what they do. Everything matters to them. Now, if you go beyond that, and this is kind of fun here, if you get into ML6 category, which is really you can reinvent yourselves and you're built for survival. There are a couple of examples out there already of that. One is very early on, the Wright brothers, who are all about bicycles to begin with. And over time, they actually decided, let's get into the airplane business. There's a whole debate in our space and other places where they say, who invented the first airplane? I really don't care about that. What I care about is they were a bicycle company that said, let's go build some airplanes. And that was brand new in the marketplace, but they decided to do that and keep their business running against that idea. And they actually grew quite well. So that is an example we're talking about here. Another good example would be something like Virgin Brands is well known as a reinvention type company. They simply go around and they say, we want to be in this marketplace now. We want to build services or products in this marketplace. So they've done records, they've done flight, they're getting into trains and train transportation here in the US eventually. They're doing space flight now. That's kind of their new edgy thing. So they've got a lot that they're doing where they're constantly building their brand into new experiences, new products. And that takes a lot of effort to know how to survive in those places, a lot of intelligence, basically.
Yeah. And I think it's fair because we talk about, the organizational maturity. That's what that level is there. Because when you think about companies such as Virgin, I have no idea if they're doing any forms of Kanban in there, but then comes like my big dilemma in life. When we look at, I sort of like levels 5 and 6 on some of the posters, it's talking about what we're achieving there. How do you then align that to some of the practices when they're not actually practicing any Kanban at all? That's a really shitty question. Sorry I asked you that, Joey, but it's been bugging me for a while.
Feel free to ask me the tough questions, please. Yes. I have to eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff every day. So I'm thinking about the same things as well. And the truth is, we have a lot of pragmatic evidence around levels 0 through 3. And then when we start to step into 4 and 6, there's evidence out there, but it's not as robust, not as voluminous, so to speak, not as heavy in volume as what we see elsewhere in the lower maturity levels. So you're right. When we look at the Kanban practices, we do have a bit of a growing pain right now that we're trying to surface and address, which is the idea that we have practices that are oriented towards real known problems and needs, which are at the lower maturity levels. And then we're trying to understand and address the problems at the higher maturity levels, which are more organizational pain points. So once you get beyond 3, you kind of start to have this really great network of systems and services running inside your organization. And if you go up to scale at, say, 3,000 people, 4,000 people or more inside an organization, they're all using Kanban to some degree, and you can see those services connected together. Then you have this question of, well, how do we get better at this? And what are some of the practices that might help us there? I think those are some of the things we're still learning about. So we don't have complete answers here. That's kind of the fun part of being part of this community, is that if you've discovered it or if you want to share something, we're all ears. So yeah, great question, Ellen.
I'll give you a break now and I'll let Andrew jump back in. Go on, Andrew.
Thanks. I think I was along a similar sort of line because I'm sort of thinking, what is the smallest granule I can kind of get my arms around in order to bring this instrument to yield some value? And I'm thinking here where we might start in engineering and we've got engineering ticking over quite nicely, and then we start to move into the broader enterprise, and all of a sudden we find actually by the time we get over into finance, things really are quite dire. Work tends to live or die by the way it's procured. And so if we can look at the way, and I think this, to your point, Helen, about organizational maturity and the Kanban maturity is different. And so I'm thinking about Kanban maturity as applied to individual services, as a network of services, which gives us this spread across the enterprise. So we can see, instead of having a center of gravity where we see different maturity levels, it's almost like we could apportion the maturity to the services in an enterprise service sort of mindset. I'm just wondering, and maybe Joe, you spoke to this when you said there's not that much data yet in the higher levels of maturity where I'd see engineering leading and then taking sales, marketing, even finance along for the ride. Yeah,
Great point, Andrew. A lot of times, and some of you know, I know some of the people here on the call, you've probably seen evidence of, we start Kanban over here, it starts to show success and we do it over here. Like I did it with the Department of Labor here in the US in their public relations area. And my focus was purely technical. And I was just trying to save a program that was just kind of funky. And we moved that into a services format after about 13 months and really got some progress after that. And it was visual, it was a physical board. And that physical board actually did some advertising work for us to say, hey, look, there are other ways to manage work. And suddenly the social media team wanted access to this approach. The audiovisual team wanted access to this approach. The content management team wanted this. And then eventually central IT said, hey, can you guys tell us more about what you're doing? Because we were actually forecasting their behavior off of the data that we had, because we had to rely on central IT for something. So that's typically how it unfolds in terms of maturity, in my view, is that it's going to be at the services level, and that quite likely the budgetary system around the organization is going to focus more or less in those division type areas, which are probably one or more services. And you're going to find, for example, if you say, well, let's assess the organization's maturity, you're going to find a hodgepodge of different aspects of maturity depending on what you're looking at. Because again, you're probably looking at the services as major arms of capability that the organization has in place to succeed in the marketplace.
Yeah, and the if you're taking a services approach, that cuts right across the traditional structures. So it throws a completely different light on it from an integrated point of view, and surfaces a lot of what Steve Blank speaks to as organizational technical debt, which I love that. Yeah,
well, you got to be careful with that word, because some people, it bounces around in the marketplace as a positive or negative phrase. So I'm always careful to. But one thing I do recommend for everyone here, if you're a coach or a consultant, understand your context, understand your language before speaking too loudly about something. So you might say organizational technical debt and think, woohoo, I know this really well. And you might. The minute you say to an organization that's scared to acknowledge that, you've run them off and they're not interested in listening to you. So just keep that in the back of your head as you talk to people, that we're super geeks. We love this stuff. And people are like, what's Kanban? What are we doing here? Why do you even call it Kanban? Does that even matter to me? I have a problem over here I need to have solved. So I kind of always want to be empathetic to the customer's problems first before jumping into the technical debt realm. But some people do get it. You're right. I mean, it's worth it to say, look, you've got a lot of things you've been avoiding. How do we help you cross the bridge and not avoid those things using this incremental evolutionary change approach?
Brilliant. We have hit our time. So want to say thank you very much, Joey. Let's give him another round of applause. I appreciate you taking some quite hard questions there. I feel like we need to have a coffee at some point so I can just keep on grilling you with all of these little niggles that I've got in life. That could probably be a good conversation in itself. But I appreciate you giving up your time and coming along and supporting this community, because we do all love Kanban at heart and we are all super geeky.
Yeah, I would give you guys a hug if I could, physically in the room, be like, all right, keep going, right? Because, I will be first to admit, I don't know it all, but I'm very passionate about learning and practicing this craft. And I'm glad you're here doing it.